Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Eric Schurenberg. I will tell you all about Eric in a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that focuses on what's so often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment that we exert toward others. And we do it as a leader, as you will definitely discover that Eric is. You do it with a commitment to bringing people together for common cause. Eric Schurenberg, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
Great. I want to tell folks all about you. And could you move just a little closer to the mic? I'm sorry. I just wanted to get that a bit, if possible. Okay. Eric is a successful media executive, an award-winning journalist. And his passion now, and what we're going to talk about is an important issue, fighting the tide of toxic misinformation and polarization. He co-hosts a podcast called In Reality with Joan Donovan of Harvard's Shorenstein Center. Before that, he was CEO of Mansueto Ventures, the owner of Inc. and Fest Company, where I first got to meet Eric. And we also crossed paths on a previous venture of his, because he did CBS work for BNet at CBS property. He's been an award-winning journalist, all kinds of stuff, and managing editor of Money Magazine, winner of all kinds of awards, including the National Magazine Award, which is really hard to get, folks. So anyway, Eric, it is a pleasure to have you. Welcome to Grace Under Pressure. So
it's great to be here.
Great. Eric, as you know, I always kind of viewed George Orwell. I think I studied and first came across Eric Blair, a pen name, as in high school and maybe a little bit at university, and reading things like Animal Farm or stuff like that, or then later his essays and things. And I always kind of viewed it through the quaint lens of history. Well, it seems like he was prescient for our times. What's your take on that, Eric?
Yes, well, we are very much living in history, aren't we? If you remember that in 1984, the euphemistically named Ministry of Truth was a font of government misinformation and propaganda, and people were exposed to nothing else but propaganda. It reminds people of, say, Soviet Russia or current Russia, and where people kind of believe, as in the words of Hannah Arendt, everything is possible and nothing is true. And unfortunately, there are signs that our society is headed for something like that state.
Great. Anyway, I'm sorry, there was a little technical glitch there, but I think we were okay. Anyway, excuse me. So yes, when you mentioned Hannah Arendt, I mean, that is she having lived through Nazi Germany and explored that throughout her career as a philosopher and somewhat historian, I think. She certainly knew that up close. And so where we are now is this odd kind of weird. Have you thought about how we got here?
Well, it's a long story and decades in the making. It'll be decades in the repair as well. One of the influences, though, I think is, and that is perhaps not recognized enough, is the role of Russia, since we brought it up in connection with Hannah Arendt, who, in addition to living through Nazi Germany and experiencing that regime's propaganda firsthand, she also observed the way it played out in Soviet Russia. And there were a number of techniques that have been adopted by spreaders of disinformation here in the U.S. I alluded to that quote from Arendt before about how everything is possible is nothing and nothing is true. One of the techniques of misinformation that we see a lot is not to try to promote a particular ideology necessarily, but instead to attack existing ideologies or truths or institutions that are driven by truth, like media at its best or science and so forth, by just flinging all kinds of ideas and possibilities at any particular event, regardless of whether those possibilities are internally contradictory or plausible or anything. Right. Just for example of how it plays out in Russian disinformation. by the way, the Russians invented the term disinformation. You remember when before the current war in Ukraine, there were conflicts, of course, in the eastern region of that country, and a Malaysian airliner was shot down over Ukraine by a mysterious missile that no one took credit for. It was probably an errant missile fired by the Russian-backed revolutionary government in eastern Ukraine. But Russian propaganda began to throw out a lot of different false possibilities about it, without evidence, without fear that the hypotheses they were throwing out were correct or not. It didn't happen. It did happen, but it was a missile fired by the Ukrainians. It was all manufactured by propaganda to tear down Russian belief. It was an internal explosion at the air. All of these things were thrown out there without evidence. But the whole idea was to just say, to kind of raise the notion that we don't really know what happened, and you can't trust any of the sources because they're probably all corrupt. That technique has been adopted by people who would spread misinformation, regardless of what their orientation is. The Hannah Arendt.
The insidious thing about that, Eric, is in good old Americanism, we call it throwing things at the wall and see what sticks. I mean,
well, yes, that's true. The quote from Stephen Bannon, who has been a source of disinformation, I would say, is "flood the zone with shit." And if you'll pardon the language, that's his quote. But it's basically the same kind of thing. Just throw out a lot of different ideas, undermine the trust in institutions that are driven by factuality, and then you can basically make any claim you want.
And that's the insidious thing about it. And especially if you don't necessarily have a plan, but you're against something, your role then becomes to tarnish the other side so badly that it's nothing, that you tear them down. And that is such an erosion of, I'm not going to say anti-human because it is human, but it's not humane and not compassion. But it muddies the water and it makes truth fungible. And of course, it's not. So, yeah.
Yes. None of us has the ability to verify everything that we come across in media. And so we rely a lot on institutions that we trust for truthfulness. And, think about them. The science, the scientific method, or media when it's operating well, public health, even government when it is operating well. And if you undermine truth in those, then the idea is that perhaps you become the sole source of truth.
Yeah, and there's that very famous quote, I'm sure you know, from Senator Dan Patrick Moynihan: everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And unfortunately, opinion masquerades as facts depending on what news channel you watch. And that's the scary part. So, I mean, you're old enough to remember when we had, quote, 3 authoritative networks, the New York Times and different newspapers across the country. Not all of them were, quote, liberal, but they were more or less considered factors, truth on there. There were opinion pages, of course, where they could vent their opinions, but express. But we don't really we have that, but it's all a mishmash of all kinds of stuff. Would you agree, Eric?
Well, I don't want to romanticize that era. The powers the corporate powers that brought us sort of broadcast news and things in those days were slanted and had their own kind of establishment points of view. And there were plenty of conspiracy theories back then. It was much harder to spread those. And that is what has changed because of the fragmentation of the media landscape, the growth of social media. Now a lie, to paraphrase a quote from Mark Twain, can spread around the world in milliseconds, while the truth is still putting on its boots.
Well, yeah, when you mention conspiracy theories of that era, I always think of the John Birch Society. And it was none other than Barry Goldwater, who was certainly not liberal, who kicked them out of the Republican Party. And that was a statement of this is what we stand for. We are conservatives, but we're not crazies. I mean, let's be honest, the left has had its own share of folks who are way out of the solar the solar system, shall we say, kindly. But I respect that what somebody like Barry Goldwater of the conservative element saying no, this is taking a stand. We don't have folks who do that today. So,
well, we do have people who take a stance, and I have to admire them. And I mean, one person who's taken a stand on behalf of truth at great political cost is Liz Cheney, for example, and Adam Kinzinger.
Yes, thank you for correcting me. Yes. Yeah.
And there is a whole ecosystem of people who are trying to solve this problem that you correctly identified at the beginning of the show of that is sort of massive and potentially destructive to democracy, of misinformation and disinformation. There are plenty of researchers. Joan Donovan, my former co-host of In Reality, is one of the leading lights in that business. It's hard though. It costs nothing to plant a seed of doubt. It's very easy in this era of social media and media fragmentation to spread falsehoods, and unfortunately, defending truth these days becomes kind of a whack-a-mole game of fighting back against, rabid, toxic lies.
It certainly does. And I'm glad you mentioned Liz Cheney, because there's a quote that she alluded to, and Jamie Raskin has verified it too, that Jamie Raskin on the left, of course, and Liz Cheney, a very, very conservative, said they look, and they're both serving on the committee for investigating January 6th. And they said, we look forward to the day we don't agree anything, but except for the preservation of democracy, isn't it going to be a great day when we can debate the issues again? And that's really what we're all about. I mean, progressives, conservatives, independents will have a point of view, but if you're anti-autocratic, or if you're trafficking in conspiracy theories, you're only being destructive. You're not adding to the public good, certainly. So
I would, yes, John, you're absolutely right. And I would just add, as a note of caution and humility, that all of us are susceptible to misinformation. It spreads on both sides of the political aisle, and it is, in the absence of those sort of easier days when there were only a few media outlets, it's now necessary on us to be kind of our own fact checkers and verifiers, and also to be alert to the ways that people spreading falsehoods take advantage of the way our brains work. So,
right.
If you, so there are a couple earmarks that I would say that you should pay attention to when you are being fed information. One is to observe whether that information is attempting to play to your emotions. So does it outrage you? Does it surprise you? Is it incredibly novel? Does it disgust you? That kind of thing.
Right. And I came across something in researching our interview, something called the illusory truth effect. And I'm going to read a little bit. Essentially, people who see or hear a piece of misinformation that isn't challenged, the more likely they are to make it seem true. And as you said, misinformation tugs at our emotions, grabs your attention, and it's appealing to your particular point of view. And as you said, Eric, it causes it to spread further and faster. And, we want to share it with people we know, like, Eric, did you hear this type of thing? And then when that happens, we're in a world of trouble. So what do we do about this, Eric?
It starts with us, and it starts with us being wiser consumers of news. So as that as you were quoting from that article, be alert to when a story, a post, something that is retweeted in your direction, whether it tugs at your emotions, and just be alert. It might be trying to take advantage of just the way you work. And I would also caution you to be alert if something that comes your way is particularly attuned to the narratives that you have about, and that's how we order the world. That's how we make sense of the world, by telling stories about it. But if something aligns really well with the stories that you have about what is true and what is not, just take a step back and think about, what is the source? Why is this so perfectly aligned with the story? Who benefits from this? And be careful not to be what the Russian propagandists refer to as a useful idiot who spreads their disinformation on their behalf.
Absolutely. Well, there's something I came across, and I think it's Google is behind this, and it's called pre-bunking. It's a tactic to inform viewers about misinformation by showing them how misinformation spreads, and it's aimed at younger people. So to me, it sounds like a great idea. Have you come across this at all, Eric?
Yes. In fact, there's an organization that I admire quite a lot called the News Literacy Project. And it is basically a course in pre-bunking, or sort of help inoculating you against misinformation. And it goes into middle schools and high schools and teaches kids to be better consumers of news and to recognize when something that might be false is spreading their way, or at least to evaluate the news they consume for its plausibility. One thing we can't do is put the genie of the fragmentation of media back in the bottle. We're never going to go back to the Walter Cronkite days. So we're just going to have to live with a world of user-generated content and fragmented news media and become better consumers ourselves. Another point about pre-bunking is that it puts in the hands of the news consumer the power to make judgments about news. Debunking, which happens after a falsehood starts to spread, tends to be ineffective. The falsehood can already take root. Trying to debunk it and repeating what they said actually can make it just send those roots deeper and make people believe it more just because you're repeating it.
That's the cruel irony of it. And something that there's an issue that when the purpose of misinformation or disinformation is to divide us. And the sad thing about that is Arthur C. Brooks has written about this in one of his books, and he talked about the lack of compassion. And when we believe the worst of people, what happens is we feel contempt or hatred, and then contempt. And once that takes root, as you said, Eric, the door's open to anything. That's how genocide would proliferate, because if I believe in you as less than human, well, I'm just doing my job. So, and that's pretty darn scary. So,
yes, yeah, I would say that one of the things that you should consider when you're consuming news is to, especially if it's particularly arresting or infuriating, is who benefits from spreading this news. And the genius of the Russian interference in the 2016 election was not so much that they created false narratives and then managed to implant them and spread them, although they did do a little of that. The genius was that they took hateful narratives, angry narratives that were created by Americans, and then just amplified them and made them seem like these fringe ideas were actually much more widespread than they really were.
This is the second time third time you've said this. Who benefits? And you are an award-winning journalist and an editor, and I know you've had countless conversations. Either you're a reporter or editor when you get a source. Okay, what's the agenda of that source? Did you not have to go through that proofing of finding out when you would get things like this? So
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And often with some particular sources of news, the agenda is simply to enrage you and to keep you watching the program or on the social media site. And that is one of the unfortunate results of the social media algorithms that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram use, which is to prolong your time on site. YouTube would be another one. Prolong the time that you're on the site so they can sell more ads while they have your attention. And of course, one of the best ways to do that is to amplify outrageous information. That's another way that just sort of mechanically, because of the way the internet works, divisive misinformation tends to get spread and be amplified well beyond the number of people who actually believe in it. And sort of it gives the impression that, there are whole armies of Americans out there who have these beliefs, when that may not necessarily be true. It's just the way your news feed is organized. It's just the way it's being amplified by people who have agendas and are trying to spread misinformation.
Right. Well, you've talked about the role of us, which I still think it is. We are paramount. We need to be discerning consumers. Journalists have a role to do. Does business have a role in this, Eric? I mean, is this something that we should address or talk about in the workplace, or what would be your perspective on that?
Well, unfortunately, you can't avoid it. I think if you're a business leader, your workforce, your colleagues are going to be exposed to misinformation all the time. I would say there are a couple things about this. One is that, and one that I think you should not bend on, is that you need to be allied with truth. You need to understand the rules of factuality. You need to make sure that the information that you're sharing and that your team is sharing is factual. Don't give up on that. So there are some things that are just not true. The fact that some people on your staff may sincerely believe them does not make them more true or less untrue. That said, you need to approach those people who are your colleagues who have fringe beliefs with understanding. You're not going to persuade them with logic or a lot of footnotes that what they believe is not true. You should try to dig into what it is that underlies those beliefs, show understanding, and then having won their trust by being sincerely curious about their beliefs, you can plant a seed that perhaps there is another way of looking at things. And
that's a very
time get people to come around.
Yeah. That's a very powerful point. And Adam Grant, in his most recent book, Think Again, addresses this when he talked about anti-vaxxers. And he profiled a physician, I think it's in Montreal, and they call him the vaccine whisperer. And because when a parent would come in saying that her children had not been vaccinated, they would introduce him to this physician, and he would not come in and say, you need to have vaccines for XYZ reason. He would just say, why don't you believe in, tell me why vaccines are problematic, and just engage in conversation. And so often just listening, and then having a conversation would turn them around. And I think that is really hard to do, Eric. But I think more of us need to do that. And gosh, I know for me, who is very impatient, and there's a streak of self-righteousness in me, I'll call myself on that. That's hard to do. So
yes, that's right. I mean, every fiber of your brain will be saying that's just not true. And here, let me persuade you with my knowledge. And that doesn't work. A reason that people are vulnerable to conspiracy theories, say, is that often has to do with a sense of belonging, or a sense of being excluded from elites, or a desire to have a mission in life to right some wrong that they perceive. And those are all, at least understandable and often admirable goals in themselves and deserving of respect.
Right.
Falsehood is not deserving of respect, and you need to speak up when you encounter it, but not by making somebody else wrong or making them small or aggrandizing yourself, but by understanding what the underlying motive is.
Yes, and giving them a chance to speak. I mean, the truth is the truth and how we wield it, and it is what we believe in it. But however, if we act in an imperious manner, all we do is drive those who don't agree with the truth away, and we further the divide, and kind of that's where we're at right now. So
yeah, it is where we're at. We spend so much of our time shouting at each other or shouting past each other. You know what? Just to draw an observation about the news that's happening now around the January 6th committee. There, I think I have to admire what they're doing. A lot of the evidence is provided by people who are Republicans, who have observed close-hand what happened on January 6th and telling the truth as they see it. The committee is not backing down from the truth, but they're also being extremely cautious about making sure that evidence is there, about inoculating themselves against the accusations that they're only talking to biased liberals who perceive the world in a way that that conservatives think is not accurate. I think, my observation is that slowly but surely it's starting to change some minds.
Oh, well, I think that it has, certainly amongst independents, and I think many call the word mainstream Republicans. But if you're of a certain ideological bent, then nothing's going to change your mind. But that's always been with us, maybe not in the same numbers. I always go back to the American Revolution with John Adams said, a third of them were with us, a third of them were Tories, and a third were just sitting on the fence waiting to see who won, And so kind of, I think, I don't know that the third works right now, but there is that element in there. And and I think it's and there isn't, the other thing is the way you present things. And you alluded to the January 6th committee. It's dispassion is a sense there for the most part, and that is that communicates. There's no shouting. There's no, this is what it is. So
on my podcast, in reality, my most recent guest was the author of a book called Collective Illusions. His name is Todd Rose. He's also the founder of a think tank called Populous, and he does a lot of research about people's private opinions, so different from the things that they normally say to opinion pollsters. And it's the questionnaires are arranged so that you're actually saying what you think, not what you think you're supposed to think, or what you think other people who are part of your tribe think. And what he found there was that when you ask Democrats and Republicans about their hopes for America, and there were many different choices that you could say were sort of the ideal aspirations for America, the 8 of the top 10 for both sides of the aisle were the same. Everyone has privately has the same aspirations for America, that they believe in individual freedom, that they believe in equality of opportunity, they believe in healthcare for everyone and education, quality education for everyone. The fact that misinformation is dividing us so much is also playing on this idea that we believe that fringe ideas are the way everyone in our group thinks, just because of the process of amplification through social media and certain slanted media outlets. But it's not really true. In the privacy of their own minds, people are actually a lot closer together.
Eric, I have to say that is one of the most heartwarming things I have heard in a long time. 8 out of 10 agree with the same things. Boy, I guess we are Americans after all, aren't we? So there is, or as Bill Clinton, I believe, said in his first inaugural, I believe there is more that unites us than divides us. So anyway, so Eric, we're racing to the end of the show. And as you know, I ask every guest a story of grace, which I frankly think what you just shared is a story of grace. Do you have a story you want to share with us? So
yes. Well, thank you for asking, John. I have a very personal one that goes back to when I was a teenager in one of my very first jobs. I was pumping gas in a gas station in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was going to prep school in nearby. And most of the men I worked with, they were all men, were from Appalachia. So we were quite different, in levels of education and where our futures would take us. And they were nice guys, but there were many areas in which we didn't agree. One of them was, or at least didn't sort of align. And one of them was the way we talked. I had a vocabulary and an accent that I had picked up from school. And they had vocabularies and accents that they picked up from their upbringing in, Northern Kentucky and West Virginia and Southeastern Ohio. And they would often say to me, "Why do you talk that way?" And I had no answer. Then my dad got transferred and we were going to move to upstate New York. And I had my car needed a new water pump before we could make this trip. And I tried my best as a prep school kid to install a water pump on my car, and it leaked. Everything I tried didn't improve it. And finally I was tightening the nut so much in an effort to stop the leak that I broke the bolt off. And then I didn't know what to do. It looked to me like I had screwed everything up. My family would not be able to leave Ohio now, and my car there was no remedy for it except to junk it. And in frustration, I remember walking home practically in tears. When I came back the next morning to, have the car towed or whatever I thought would happen, I found that my colleagues, the men from Appalachia who could not communicate with me, had fixed it. They had saved the day out of their own grace and their own desire to use their skills to help out this kid from another culture, as it were. And I thought, God, that was a real act of generosity and grace, and it stuck with me all these years.
It's a beautiful story. It is a beautiful story. And again, it cements, we're all human. We're people. And I want to believe there's more that brings us together because we're human beings and we crave connectedness. So, but a beautiful story. Eric, thank you for being our guest today. And how can people find you? So,
well, they should. I hope they'll subscribe to my podcast, which is called In Reality, and just find it at inreality.fm or on any of the podcast catchers, whichever one you use.
Great. Eric, thank you for being on the show today. And with that, we're going to close out. So.